Trump just froze $89 billion in Canadian government and institutional assets held inside American banks, using the exact same legal authority Washington has historically reserved for countries like Iran, Russia, North Korea, Syria, and Venezuela. The law is the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA, a tool designed for hostile states, rogue regimes, and national security emergencies. And now it has been turned on America's closest ally. But what happened next is what truly shook the financial world. Within 6 hours, Mark Carney answered, and his response did far more than push back against the freeze. It set off what may become the largest single-day shift of foreign sovereign money out of U.S. financial institutions in modern history. Roughly $2.3 trillion suddenly entered motion because of one message Carney sent, not just to Canada, but to every government on Earth. Warren Buffett reportedly described it as the most self-destructive financial move by an American president since Nixon ended the gold window in 1971. And the most devastating part of this whole story is this: Trump froze $89 billion that was mostly no longer there. Canada had already spent the prior 90 days quietly transferring its money out. In effect, Trump pointed a financial weapon at an almost empty vault, and Carney used that mistake to persuade the rest of the world to clear out theirs too. Let's break down exactly what Trump did, what he expected it would achieve, and why the assumptions behind the decision collapsed almost immediately. The executive order was signed Sunday night and became active Monday morning. It invoked IEEPA, the extraordinary legal authority that gives the U.S. president power to block or freeze foreign assets whenever the executive branch declares a national emergency. This is not a tariff mechanism. This is not an ordinary trade penalty. This is among the most severe financial weapons the United States possesses. It is the same statute used to freeze Iranian assets after the 1979 hostage crisis, the same authority used against Russian oligarch wealth after the invasion of Ukraine, and the same framework used to restrict North Korea's access to global finance. In every major prior case, this authority was aimed at states Washington considered enemies or direct adversaries, governments with which the United States had deeply hostile relationships and no expectation of trust-based cooperation. This time, it was used against Canada. The order targeted three main categories of Canadian assets. First, Canadian government accounts in U.S. banks, including funds used for sovereign transactions, diplomatic operations, and reserve management. Second, Crown Corporation accounts, meaning financial holdings connected to state-owned entities such as Canada Post, the CBC, and infrastructure-related agencies. And third, institutional investment accounts, including pensions, endowments, and sovereign investment vehicles. Total amount frozen, about $89 billion. The stated justification was a supposed economic emergency caused by hostile Canadian trade behavior threatening American national security and economic stability. Legal experts immediately questioned that rationale. IEEPA is supposed to require a genuine emergency, something immediate, severe, and exceptional enough to justify extraordinary executive action. A trade conflict with a Democratic ally, a NATO member, a G7 partner, and the country sharing the world's longest undefended border with the United States simply does not fit that threshold under any normal reading of the statute. But by the time lawyers began debating the legality, the financial damage was already underway. The freeze took effect instantly. No phased rollout. No diplomatic advance notice. No quiet consultation between allies. Canadian financial officials learned what had happened when Monday morning transactions started failing. Wire transfers were rejected. Accounts became inaccessible. Routine operations that had functioned normally for decades suddenly slammed into a wall. Canada's finance ministry did not hear it first from the White House, the State Department, or any formal diplomatic channel. They found out through frantic calls from Canadian banking institutions asking why they could no longer access their own funds. No warning. No phone call. No diplomatic cable. Canadian institutions woke up and discovered that overnight, a foreign government had locked the doors to their own money. The intended strategy was brutally simple: freeze $89 billion, create maximum pressure, force Canada to negotiate on Washington's terms. The money was leverage. The accounts were hostages. It was the logic of coercion applied to international finance. And it only worked if the target had not prepared. That was the mistake. Because Mark Carney had prepared. Carney was not improvising. He is a man who spent 13 years at Goldman Sachs, who led the Bank of Canada through the 2008 global financial crisis without a single Canadian bank collapse, and who later ran the Bank of England through Brexit and multiple UK political shocks. He understands financial plumbing better than almost anyone in global public life. And 6 hours after the freeze took effect, he stood at a podium in Ottawa before a room packed with journalists, analysts, and diplomats and delivered a sentence that stunned every newsroom following the story. He said he wanted to assure Canadians and the broader international community that Canada's financial position remained secure, and that the U.S. actions that morning affected approximately $12 billion, not $89 billion, in Canadian institutional assets. The room froze. Not with anticipation, but with the silence of people recalculating reality in real time. Because if Washington had supposedly frozen $89 billion, yet only $12 billion was actually caught, then the obvious conclusion was that most of the money had already been moved. And Carney calmly explained that yes, that is exactly what had happened. Canadian intelligence, working alongside the Bank of Canada and the Finance Ministry, had judged for about 4 months that an American asset freeze was increasingly likely. Once that risk shifted from hypothetical to probable, once it became clear the Trump administration was seriously considering such a move, Canada launched an internal operation reportedly known as Operation Sovereign Shield. Over the course of 90 days, Canada systematically transferred sovereign and institutional assets out of U.S. financial institutions. The movement was done quietly, gradually, and with amounts carefully structured to avoid drawing market attention or triggering obvious regulatory flags that might alert U.S. authorities. Funds were redirected into Canadian domestic banks, custodial facilities at the Bank of England, reserve management systems tied to the European Central Bank, and a newly established Canadian sovereign wealth structure based in Switzerland. Every transfer had been planned in advance. Every destination institution was prepared. Every legal filing was completed beforehand. It was executed with the precision of someone who understands exactly how money travels through the global system and how to shift it without leaving a visible trail. Of the $89 billion Washington believed it had trapped, $77 billion had already been removed. Only around $12 billion remained. And according to Carney's explanation, that remaining amount had not been left there by accident. It was residual money kept in place because fully emptying the accounts too abruptly could have raised alarms. In other words, Canada had effectively left the lights on in a house it had already vacated. Trump froze assets that were mostly gone. He aimed at a vault that had quietly been cleared out over 3 months by a man who knew the freeze was probably coming. That was only the first move. The second came almost immediately. Within an hour, Canada announced that it was freezing all American government and corporate assets held in Canadian financial institutions under the Special Economic Measures Act, Canada's own equivalent mechanism. Total frozen, about $143 billion. This was not symbolic. It was not a headline gesture. It was a carefully calculated counterstrike aimed at the broadest possible range of U.S. financial exposure inside Canada. Operating accounts of American corporate subsidiaries doing business in Canada, frozen. U.S. pension fund holdings in Canadian equities, frozen. U.S. government securities held through Canadian intermediaries, frozen. Operating capital tied to American bank branches, frozen. Compare the numbers. The United States actually captured about $12 billion. Canada froze $143 billion. The ratio was not close. The hostage takers suddenly realized 2 things at once. First, the hostage had already escaped. Second, the hostage was holding far more hostages in return. But Carney's third move is the one that truly detonated the markets. He held a second press event, and this one was not mainly for Canadians. It was explicitly addressed to the international financial community, to finance ministers, central bankers, sovereign wealth funds, and governments with money parked inside the American financial system. And what he said next changed everything. Carney told the world that if the United States was willing to freeze the financial assets of its closest ally, a NATO partner, a G7 nation, a Five Eyes intelligence partner, a country with an undefended border and 75 years of peaceful cooperation, then no foreign government should assume its own assets in American financial institutions were safe. Not Europe's. Not Japan's. Not South Korea's. Not Australia's. Then came the line that financial historians will probably quote for decades: your money in American banks is not a deposit. It is a hostage. That sentence hit global finance like a shockwave, not because it was dramatic, but because it landed with cold, professional logic. Every finance minister, every reserve manager, every sovereign wealth official hearing it understood immediately what the rational response was: reduce exposure, diversify custody, and move money. Carney's fourth move then followed: full-scale financial decoupling. He announced the immediate use of a Canadian-European settlement platform for bilateral trade with EU countries, bypassing the US dollar altogether. He announced bilateral currency swap arrangements with Japan, South Korea, the United Kingdom, and Australia, deals that had reportedly been negotiated quietly in prior months and were now activated simultaneously. He also declared that Canadian sovereign reserves would from that point forward be held exclusively in non-U.S. institutions as a permanent structural policy, not a short-term negotiating tactic. For moves in 6 hours, empty the vault, counter-freeze at overwhelming scale, activate alternative settlement channels, and warn the world that money in American banks could now be treated as politically vulnerable. Then markets reacted, not so much to the Canadian freeze itself, but to the warning that followed. Once Carney revealed that only $12 billion had truly been trapped, the initial U.S. action looked less like a show of strength and more like a strategic blunder. But his statement to the world, that sovereign money in U.S. institutions could now be politically weaponized, was something else entirely. The Dow began falling as soon as Carney's second message moved across the wires. Bank stocks led the sell-off. J.P. Morgan Chase reportedly dropped 9%. Bank of America fell 12%. Citigroup sank 14%. Wells Fargo, Goldman Sachs, and Morgan Stanley all fell somewhere between 8% and 15%. It was the worst single-day performance for the U.S. banking sector since the earliest phase of the COVID market collapse. The reason was simple and structural: if foreign governments begin removing sovereign deposits from U.S. banks, those banks lose one of their cheapest and most stable funding bases. Lose the deposits, and balance sheets contract. Lending and investment capacity weakens. Profitability falls. Share prices follow. Within hours, Norway's sovereign wealth fund, the largest in the world and worth more than $1.7 trillion, launched an emergency review of its exposure to American financial institutions. Saudi Arabia's Public Investment Fund began what it described as precautionary transfers of liquid assets to European and Asian custodians. Singapore's GIC and Temasek publicly referenced jurisdictional concentration risk, a diplomatic way of saying they were reconsidering how much money should remain in the U.S. At the same time, the European Central Bank reportedly held emergency discussions on dollar reserve exposure and alternative custody structures. The Bank of Japan said it was monitoring developments and reviewing risk management procedures. In plain language, central banks around the world were not treating this as a one-off political spat. They were treating it as a signal that the rules of sovereign asset safety inside the United States had changed. Total estimated assets entering transfer procedures or formal review within 24 hours of Carney's statement, around $2.3 trillion. Think about the ratio. Trump froze $89 billion, but only $12 billion was actually there. Carney's response triggered movement or formal review of $2.3 trillion away from American institutions. That is close to a 200-to-1 blowback ratio. The U.S. dollar reportedly fell 3.2% against a basket of major currencies in a single trading session, its worst one-day decline in more than a decade. And unlike normal currency moves driven by trade, inflation, or interest rate spreads, this fall was driven by something far more dangerous: the sudden loss of trust. Reserve currency power depends on foreign governments believing their dollar assets are secure from arbitrary political seizure. That assumption had been one of the deepest pillars of U.S. financial dominance. And now that pillar was cracking. That is why Warren Buffett's comments carried so much weight. Berkshire Hathaway has held enormous positions in U.S. financial institutions for decades, and the sell-off was costing the company billions even as he spoke. Yet he reportedly did not soften his view. He said that after 60 years of investing in American banks, this was the first time he was seriously questioning that bet. Freezing an ally's accounts, he argued, was the financial equivalent of burning down your own house just to punish your neighbor, except the house being burned was the one where the entire world keeps its valuables. The strength of the American financial system, Buffett emphasized, has always depended on foreign governments believing their reserves were safe from politics. That confidence took generations to build. One executive order aimed at America's closest ally had damaged it in a single stroke. And on Carney's response, Buffett's point was brutal in its clarity: Carney did not have to defeat the freeze. The freeze undermined itself. All Carney had to do was show it to the world and say, in effect, look what they did to us, who's next? That one sentence, your money in American banks is not a deposit, it is a hostage, may end up costing the United States more than any tariff, sanction, trade war, or military action ever has, because it attacked the thing that mattered most: credibility. Buffett then reportedly added another jolt to the story by revealing that Berkshire had already begun trimming exposure to U.S. bank stocks roughly a year earlier, not because this specific order had been foreseen, but because the broader pattern suggested the American financial system was being transformed from a global service into a political weapon. And political weapons, he said, are bad long-term investments. The fallout did not stop with market panic. Within 48 hours, 11 sovereign wealth funds had formally announced diversification reviews covering a combined $4.7 trillion in assets. These were not emotional reactions. These were structured, public reviews by some of the most sophisticated institutions on the planet. The European Central Bank accelerated work on euro-based alternatives to dollar clearing. China expanded renminbi settlement agreements with a dozen more countries, giving trade partners additional ways to operate outside the dollar system. The Bank for International Settlements reportedly opened emergency discussions about new multilateral settlement mechanisms that would reduce dependence on U.S.-controlled financial infrastructure. And the irony at the center of all this was staggering: the country Trump intended to bring to heel, Canada, did not collapse. Canadian banks reported higher deposits as assets returned from U.S. custody. The Toronto Stock Exchange actually edged upward as investors concluded Canada now looked like the safer jurisdiction. Canadian bond yields tightened as demand increased. The Canadian dollar strengthened against the U.S. dollar. The weapon hit the wrong target. Canada's markets rose. America's fell. U.S. bank CEOs were said to be furious. Reports from financial circles claimed Jamie Dimon told a senior administration official, in essence, that the White House had just handed every foreign government on earth a reason to pull money out of American banks, and asked whether they understood what that meant for the deposit base. Meanwhile, the Federal Reserve reportedly discussed emergency liquidity support options, not because banks were instantly insolvent, but because they were watching sophisticated foreign depositors reduce exposure in real time. And that brings us to the real ledger of this disaster. Trump signed an order freezing $89 billion in Canadian assets, but Canada had already removed $77 billion, leaving only about $12 billion genuinely trapped. Carney responded by freezing $143 billion in American assets, flipping the hostage logic completely. Then he warned the world that sovereign money in American banks was no longer safe, and that warning triggered the movement or formal review of roughly $2.3 trillion in global assets. U.S. bank stocks reportedly lost around $340 billion in market value in one session. The dollar suffered its worst daily drop in more than a decade. Sovereign wealth funds started reconsidering trillions more. Europe accelerated alternatives. China expanded $9 settlement systems. The global architecture built around 8 decades of dollar dominance began showing signs of fracture in real time. And all of it came back to one catastrophic miscalculation. Trump thought he was punishing Canada. He was actually punishing the dollar, punishing U.S. banks, punishing American retirement portfolios, and punishing the trust that made American financial supremacy possible in the first place. Canada had already moved. Canada was ready. Carney had spent 3 months preparing for the freeze before the order was ever signed. Trump believed he was taking a hostage. Carney showed the vault was nearly empty, froze 12 times more in return, activated $9 alternatives, and delivered one sentence that may echo through global finance for a generation. Your money in American banks is not a deposit. It is a hostage. And once that truth is spoken out loud, the system cannot go back to what it was before. The money starts moving. The trust starts fading. And the age of unquestioned dollar dominance begins to crack, not because of China, not because of Europe, but because an American president aimed the most powerful financial weapon in the arsenal at the wrong target, at the wrong moment, in the wrong way, and Mark Carney was already waiting.